Почну мою першу презентацію. Okay. So, welcome to our conference, supporting Ukrainians by learnings of Ukrainian. My request is that, just one final request, if you are not presenting, please turn off your microphone, please turn off your camera. Якщо ви не презентуєте, прошу, щоб ви не використовували свого мікрофону, ані свої камери. Дуже дякую. So today I'm going to start by introducing the conference. It's called Support Ukrainians by Learning Ukrainian. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Timothy Douglas. I work at the School of Engineering here at Lancaster University. And some of you may be wondering why are we organizing this conference yet again? This is the fourth time we've organized. Who will be speaking some practical matters and how I would like to continue in the future. So we started having this conference earlier this year in July because at the time I noticed that there were many people who were learning Ukrainian, and I thought it would be nice to have a conference in order to unite them, as it were. And there was enough interest. So I organized a second conference on the 30th of August. And thankfully, because there's been continued interest, we organized the third one on the 9th of December. And all of them are focused on Ukrainian language, but with in a way that's connected to the situation of Ukrainians. As you know very well, many Ukrainians have been displaced by war or suffering as a result of this war. So, and there are many ways in which knowledge of Ukrainian language can help them. And this is also one thing we've been exploring in this new series of conferences. So, I think that to explain why, we are organizing these conferences and why we continue to organize them, I think it's best if we show you some of the feedback that we've received. So after each conference, I ask for feedback and I ask, what did you like about the conference? Що тобі сподобалось у конференції? And I think these statements speak for themselves. Дуже вразило, як легко іноземці розмовляють українською, їхній досвід і бажання вивчити українську. The desire to study Ukrainian is appreciated. Приємно вразило захоплення українською мовою в різних країнах. Yes, in many countries. I think since February, about at least 1 million people have started to learn Ukrainian in some form or other. If you look at the statistics of the app Duolingo, I don't use Duolingo myself, but I've certainly, even being an old-fashioned learner using videos and books, I've also noticed an interest. And that was one reason why I wanted to start organizing these events. And as I mentioned, connecting with other people is a great thing about conferences, and being inspired by other people. That's one reason to organize this. Discussing the language learning with other learners, getting to know people with different expertise. And one thing that I think I really like about the people who come and speak at our conferences and the people who participate are the diversities. Language is something that impacts so many aspects. And that's one reason, because there are so many things that language is connected to. That's why we always have new things to introduce at each conference. Okay, so I'll just mention now why for what Ukrainian for me is. For me, it's like a delicious cocktail of other Slavic languages. The ones I know are Russian, which was the first I learned, and also I love Polish as well. So for me, Ukrainian is like a mixture of Russian and Polish with a little bit of Czech, and I can see, aspects of, all these three languages in Ukrainian. Of course, the Polish and the Russian aspect character is stronger. So what do we want to do today? Well, in this conference, we're asking similar questions, but could you mute your microphone, please? So, why is it worth learning Ukrainian? Of course, I'm sure you all think it's worth learning Ukrainian, but there are many different ways in which learning of Ukrainian can help people. Now, how do we learn languages? Well, there are so many different ways of learning languages. If you go online, you'll see many people with lots of different methods. Today, we will have some advice from a couple of hyperpolyglots, and hyperpolyglots are people who learn many languages. So not just one or two or three or four, but many more than that. And also, we want to explore some of the cultural differences. As many of you are aware, if you learn another language, it's not just speaking your own language with foreign words. The way in which people express themselves and the way in which people use language is different. So we'll also have a talk about cultural differences between English and Ukrainian relating to language, and how understanding this can lead to better relationships between Anglophones and Ukrainian speakers, and may be of interest to those who are hosting Ukrainians, for instance, in the framework of the Homes for Ukraine scheme in the UK. So today's program. So after I finish in a few minutes, we are going to have a talk by Steve Kaufman, a very famous hyperpolyglot who can speak 20 languages and is also the founder of Link, which is a tool for learnings of different languages. I'm sure Steve will tell us much more about that. He is also a YouTuber as well. After the break, we're going to have two talks by Natalia Vizia. And so Natalia is a language coach, speaks very good Ukrainian, English, and other languages. And she's also done a series on how, or videos on how Ukrainian sort of culture and differs from British culture and what this can mean for interactions between British people and Ukrainians. Then we have a talk from Martin Hassmann from the Czech Republic on an Mov app, which is one of his which is an initiative to create an app to help understanding between Ukrainians and Czechs. Then we'll have a talk from Dron Profashi, who has learned many very, very high number of languages, and will give us his advice on language learning in general. Okay, so may I ask one question? Are you looking, what is the screen that you can see at the moment? Is it, are you looking at the program?
Yes.
The program, thank you. Okay, yes. So I'll go on to the next slide then. So quick practical matters. We have many online participants. You're very welcome to write your questions in the chat. Either you can chat between yourselves during the presentations or ask questions for the speaker. In the breaks, I'll stop the recording, but I'll leave the chat open so you can network with each other. And I'll also, as I mentioned, we're recording the talk. So if you're not presenting, please keep your camera turned off and your microphone sort of turned off. I'll be sending a questionnaire after this to obtain your feedback. I love hearing people's opinions on events. Okay, just 2 more slides for my part. Why I find it so worth learning Ukrainian is because, or learning any language is because it connects people. You may know the quote from Nelson Mandela: if you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. And I think with Ukrainian, you can certainly win lots of hearts. I personally believe that if more of us learnt more languages and we went to each other's hearts a bit more, then our world would be a slightly happier place. And also, I love this saying by Kato Lom. She was one of the first simultaneous interpreters at the United Nations. She could do this in 10 languages without any preparation. She said, language is the only thing worth knowing even poorly, because even with a poor knowledge of a language, you can still, connect with people. Okay, so finally, I'd like to thank very much our my colleagues of Derek Hurd, who is the head of the Department of Languages and Cultures here. He's been very supportive always of this event. And also I'd like to thank my colleague, I'd like to thank Chris Coy, who has done some wonderful sort of designs. He did the poster for this conference and for my previous conference as a volunteer. Thank you very much, to him. I appreciate it a lot. And also thank you to you. You can't have a conference, as you know, if you don't have participants, and it is your interest in coming to our events as a speaker or as a spectator that makes it worth organizing. Ja хочу вам усім подякувати, тому що мені дуже подобається організувати такі заходи. Бо я бачу ваш ентузіазм для української. Okay, so that's everything from my side. I will stop sharing now, and then good. So I'd like to now invite my first speaker of the day, Steve Kaufman. Steve, are you here?
Let's activate all these things. Can you see me?
Yes, Steve, we can see you and we can hear you.
Excellent.
So just one request: if you are not presenting, please turn off your camera and please turn off your microphone. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm still on here?
Still hear you. So I'll just a few words of introduction. For many of you here, Steve won't require any introduction, but he's a hyper polyglot. He can speak over 20 languages, including Ukrainian, and he's also the founder of Link. I'm sure he'll tell us more about that, but it's a very useful tool to learn a variety of languages. And also, Steve has a YouTube channel where he publishes, very regularly videos on language learning in general, almost once every week or even more often. And so, if you're interested in hearing general advice about language learning, I would urge you to check it out. So, Steve, thank you very much for coming, and please feel free to start your presentation or share your screen as you prefer.
Okay. Доброго дня. Я дуже радий мати можливість розмовляти з вами сьогодні, але більш за все буду говорити англійською мовою. But if you have questions in Ukrainian, I would be happy to answer them as well. I have a little bit of a cold. I took the test. It's not COVID, but nevertheless. So, the few subjects that I would like to discuss. First of all, these terms like hyper-polyglot are a little bit, I would say, almost intimidating. My sort of trajectory in terms of language learning is that I learned the first one was French, and then I learned Mandarin Chinese, because I was assigned there by the Canadian government to learn Mandarin back in 1968. Then we lived in Japan. So one after another, there was no deliberate attempt to become a hyper-polyglot. Once you learn 1 or 2 or 3 languages, you realize that it's not that difficult. It just takes a lot of time and commitment. Also, with regard to speaking 20 languages, I can't really claim to be fluent in 20 languages. I have perhaps 10 or so that I'm comfortable in. Ukrainian is kind of at the mid-range, 12 or so, because I never speak Ukrainian. But when I was in Ukraine, I was comfortably speaking Ukraine, including in eastern Ukraine, in Dnipro, and I was in the outskirts of Donetsk, in Krasnohorivka, which is a community which unfortunately now has been seriously destroyed by the Russian invasion. But at that time, there were wonderful people, native speakers of Russian, all of whom were very proud and happy to speak Ukrainian. So, 20 languages, you can't possibly maintain them all because there's not enough time to read or listen or speak in 20 languages. But every language that I learn is a wonderful sort of voyage of discovery. So as Cato Lom said, a language is something worth knowing even, imperfectly. We are always imperfect in any language that we learn. There is not one language that I speak, with the possible exception of English, where I wouldn't like to speak it better, where I wouldn't like to have a larger vocabulary, where I wouldn't like to pronounce it better. We are never satisfied. We never achieve perfection in any of the languages that we learn. That doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile learning them, because as we learn the language, we learn so many other things. Right now, I'm learning Persian and Arabic. I have been at it for 3 years. It's difficult. The writing system, no matter how much I read in Persian and Arabic, I struggle with a writing system which is very different from what I'm used to. I have read millions and millions and millions of words in the Latin writing system, so it's just second nature. But when I read even Cyrillic, like Czech, I know Russian better than Czech, but it is easier for me to read Czech than to read Russian, because my brain is so much more familiar with the Latin alphabet than with the Cyrillic alphabet. Now, when we get to languages like Persian and Arabic, there's another degree of difference and difficulty. So language learning is often beset with difficulties. But if we are motivated and if we persist, we get there. And if we focus our attention on enjoying the process, then we don't worry about how well we speak, things that we forget, somebody else speaks better. None of that matters as long as we are enjoying the process of learning. So if I come now to Ukrainian, I began by learning Russian back, when I was 60. I'm 77 today. So when I was 60, I started learning Russian. My motivation was twofold. One, from my experience with Japanese and Chinese, I developed a method of learning languages based on the idea that you need a lot of exposure and that the bulk of your activity is listening and reading. And you should not focus too much on the details, the grammar, until later, until you have had so much exposure to the language that the grammar explanations actually start to make sense. Because if you start into a language by looking at the grammar, it can be, first of all, you don't believe. Like when I started into Russian, they said, you got один год, два, три, четыре года, пять лет. I said, they can't possibly do that. That's impossible. I don't believe that. So there's a tendency, not to remember these explanations, almost not to believe them, until you have had so much exposure to the language that you realize this is natural. This is how they speak. And we can't resist the way languages are different. I remember when I started learning Chinese, I had another Canadian who was learning Chinese, a government employee. And in Chinese, to say, are you going? The Chinese say, 你去不去? You go, not go. That's what they say. They don't say, are you going? They say, you go, not go. And his reaction was, is that ever stupid? I mean, you cannot. Every language is different. Every language has their own ways of saying things. And you just have to absorb it. Get it in you. Don't try to explain too much, because the explanations aren't going to help you. You just have to basically absorb it. That's how they say it. This is the pattern. Get used to the patterns of the different languages. So with that, I learned, Russian starting, I guess, about 17 years ago. Then I went to Czech. And then in 2014, I was following the events in Ukraine. And someone said I could see Ukrainians debating on Schuster Live. So I went to Schuster Live. I found it on the internet. And half the people spoke Russian and half the people spoke Ukrainian. And I could understand the Russian speakers and I couldn't understand the Ukrainian speakers. So I said, well, I better learn Ukrainian. So I started listening and reading. Right, today at Link, we have mini stories, and I will get to the mini stories in a minute. But these are stories where there's a lot of repetition, particularly of high frequency verbs. And I begin all of my languages with our 60 mini stories. However, at that time, we didn't have the mini stories for Ukrainian. So I relied a lot on Radio Svoboda, which is a tremendous resource, because I don't know now because I haven't been doing any Ukrainian, but back then you could find the audio with transcript. And I cannot understand why more radio and TV programs and podcasters don't provide transcripts. Because if you can find things of interest and you listen to them and you don't understand, or you understand 20%, 30%, if you can then access the transcript, you can then start to understand more. And you can, and again, I'll explain later how Link works, but you can actually save words and phrases and learn them. But at any rate, I spent a year listening to Radio Svoboda, Hromadske Radio, so following events in Ukraine, but in Ukrainian. And because, with my Slavic language experience, now having learned Russian and Czech, I think I had an easier time than someone who is starting from scratch. So if you are someone who has no previous experience in Slavic languages, Ukrainian will be quite difficult, because the difficulties in Slavic languages are more or less the same in all the Slavic languages that I've attempted to learn, which also includes Polish. And that is the verbs, the aspects of verbs, and verbs of motion, and of course the case endings. And to Slavic language speakers, it's not a problem. I had a comment on my YouTube channel, which, by the way, the title or the name of the channel is Lingo Steve. And I had done a video on something having to do with learning Slavic languages, or the difficulties of Russian or something like that. And this Russian person says, wow, all these foreigners, they talk about, verbs of motion. Like, that's silly. Like, we Russians, we don't do any of that, and we have no difficulty. Well, of course you have no difficulty. You spent your whole life listening to Russian or whatever, Czech or Ukrainian. So all of the patterns of those languages are second nature to you because you've listened to so much. So as a foreigner or a non-speaker of that language, you will never achieve the millions and millions and millions of hours that the native speaker has been listening to the language. But you have to consume a lot of the language. You have to listen a lot. You have to read a lot. You have to give the brain a chance to form some patterns. And the grammatical explanations, or the attempt to study the tables, the declension tables, and I don't know how many times I've read the explanation of aspects of verbs, and it has a limited impact. Limited. Grammar explanations, grammar exercises, even being corrected, has a very limited impact on your ability to learn the language. What's going to enable you to learn the language is massively listening and reading. So now let's get to Ukrainian. To me, once I started listening to Ukrainian, then I became more interested in Ukraine. And I had an online teacher in Dnipro, and she recommended some videos to me, which also had transcripts on the history of Ukraine. So learning Ukrainian became an opportunity and opened the door to learning more about the history of Ukraine. Because for the average Westerner, whose, the history of the world got, or, the world ended at like Germany and Italy. Like we had no concept of Eastern Europe in school, no concept of, let alone Central Asia, Middle East, which I'm now discovering through my, learning Arabic and Persian. So we have a very sort of limited view of the world. And so Ukraine was, weren't quite sure, is that like a province of Russia, or, what is Ukraine? So once you get into the language and you find books on the history of Ukraine, told by Ukrainians, not told by Russians, told by Ukrainians. So then you get an image of this country, which basically started roughly when so many European countries started to form, which is about 1,000 years ago. France and England and Spain and all of these countries seem to come together around 1,000 years ago, and that's also the case with Ukraine. And then Ukraine had a sort of a succession of invasions, starting with the Mongols. Well, of course, they were constantly beating back the Hungarians and the Poles, and there was all kinds of wars going on as usual. But then the Mongols came, then the Lithuanians, and the Lithuanians got together with the Poles, and the Poles weren't as tolerant as the Lithuanians in terms of matters of religion and language and stuff. And so there was the Khmelnytsky rebellion, and there were some agreements made with the Russians about autonomy for the Ukrainians, which the Russians, of course, didn't respect. And so there's a whole bunch of history. And then again in the 19th century, as was the case with the Czechs, as was the case in so many countries, with the rise of nationalism, a lot of these people, the Greeks and the Serbs and so forth, started to assert their existence as a separate national group, and so did the Ukrainians. And then we have all the history that came in the 20th century with, the Russian Revolution and so forth and so on. But when you sort of listen to, and I love listening to audiobooks, and you listen to audiobooks and you read, and you hear about the history of this country, Ukraine, which has quite an identity and a history of its own. And it's a wonderful feeling when, through a language, you discover the country. And, I mean, after all, Ukraine is a country of 45 million people. It's right up there in the top tier of countries in Europe based on its population. It's the largest in area of certainly, countries within the other than Russia. And then I have visited Ukraine, and I think there's the other benefit. Ukraine, which is suffering a tragedy right now, but I visited in, I think it was 2017, 2018. It's a wonderful country. People are very friendly, lively, interesting. The food is phenomenal. And I say that, and that's true in Lviv, it's true in Kiev, it was true in Dnipro. And so and then you have places of so much cultural interest, because if you're in Chernivtsi, there's the influence there of Romanians, of obviously the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as is the case in Lviv. You have this mixture of Polish, Jewish, German. If you go to Dnipro, there's a different, I went to Hortitsa where they had the Cossack shows, There's so much culture everywhere, so much history, good food, nice people, nice cafes. It's a tremendous tragedy what's happening right now. But I think reasons for learning Ukrainian are the same as the reasons for learning any other language. It doesn't matter if the country is large or small. The Czechs, there's only 10 million of them. It was fascinating to learn about the Czechs, the national revival in the 19th century, the whole history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Every country brings with it, when you're learning the language, such a sense of richness in discovering that country. Now, many people just want to learn the language in order to communicate. But in my experience, you cannot say, I just want to learn enough to be able to, do this. It's hard to just limit what you're going to learn. You kind of have to go at it. If you're not interested in history, you have to find something else. Maybe it's food, maybe it's music, something. You have to go beyond. You have to get a sort of a broadly based understanding of the language in order to have meaningful interaction with people. You know, I know when people offer English courses, they'll sometimes offer, you know, business English. I don't think you can learn business English. I don't think you can learn business Ukrainian. I think you have to learn the language as a whole. Now, very briefly on my background, I was a Canadian government trade commissioner, diplomat for 7 years, which is when I was in Hong Kong learning Mandarin Chinese, and then I lived in Japan. Then I worked for a major Canadian lumber wood products exporting company in Japan, and then back in Canada. And then I set up my own company in 1987 in the trade of wood products, and the company still exists. And then about 20 years ago, together with my son, we formed this company called Link, L-I-N-G-Q. And it's basically, it's based on my experience of learning languages. And that means, because a number of things happened in the world. At home, I had books in German, in Spanish, in Italian, and I would read them. And on every page, there was 5 or 10 words that I didn't know. And they bothered me because they were key to understanding that page. You sometimes hear people say, well, if you know 500 words, if you know 1,000 words, then you can understand 70% of any content or any context. That may be true, but that means you still don't understand it. In other words, the remaining 20-30%, which have a very low level of frequency, they don't show up very often, but you need them. And I would be looking these up, and I think you may have all had the experience that if you look a word up in the dictionary, no sooner do you close the dictionary, you've already forgotten the meaning that you saw there. So that it's very frustrating. So Link, and then the other thing that happened was the internet came along. We have online dictionaries. We have MP3 technology. You know, when I was learning Chinese, I had a huge open reel tape recorder. Now I can carry on my iPhone, I can carry an enormous library of audio and text material. And so Link, we developed a technology, a platform where learners can access, first of all, those things that we have in our libraries, which for all of our 43 languages includes our mini stories, where there's a lot of repetition. The same story repeats essentially 5 times. It's full of high frequency verbs, and you don't have to do anything. You don't have to think. You just allow the language to come into you. And I have listened to those for the different languages 20, 30 times. When you start into a language, you need to repeatedly listen to the same content, not at one sitting. But if you take the mini stories, you do number 1, you understand 30%, you move on to number 2, you understand 30%, you move on to number 3, and then you go back to 1 again. But over time, and we track these statistics at Link, you'll see that you'll have listened to it 30 or 40 times. And you need to do that because initially what you need to do is allow the brain to form these connections, to form patterns. When you progress in the language, then you want to move to more inherently interesting content, some of which we have in our libraries, but always with audio and text. Because if you listen to something that you just simply don't understand, it's not doing anything for you. If you listen to something and you can then access the transcript, now you can start to save those words. And in Link, if you save the words, that creates a whole bunch of functionality, whether it be flashcards, whether it be statistics. We track how many words you know, how many words you've read. We can get you to study difficult content sentence by sentence. We get you to reassemble the sentence just to make sure you understand what the word order was. I mean, there's so many different activities that come from that act of saving words in Link. But the other thing is, now once you are past a certain level, you don't want to be limited with what's in our libraries. So you can go to any website and import it into Link with the click of a button on our browser extension. You can go to YouTube if you have, as I do, there's a TV program from Lebanon, as long as there's subtitles, or if I can grab the MP3 file. What I do is I take material that I'm looking for in Persian and Arabic, where I can grab the MP3 file. I will take it to a automatic transcription website, so I get the transcript, which is 95% or 90% accurate. Now I can import the MP3 file and the transcript into Link as a lesson. And anything you bring into Link will tell you, here are the words you don't know. and all the other statistics, and it works seamlessly in Link, just as any content that we have in our library. So you have the opportunity with Link to start with very basic material and work to a level where, I mean, it's endless. You can go as far as you want. You can bring in literature. You can bring in whole ebooks as long as they're not protected by copyright. So that's going to mean 19th century or early 20th century. But you bring them in, you start looking up words and phrases. So all of this, it represents an opportunity to go as far as you want in the language, to work on certain kinds of vocabulary. If you're in a particular scientific field, you just bring in content from that field. So I think I'll leave it there. I should finish off by saying that Link is free for all Ukrainians, whether refugees in Europe, and we have Hungarian, Romanian, German, wherever a Ukrainian refugee happens to be, he or she can learn the local language at Link free of charge. You just have to contact support@link.com and you will be given a free access. Otherwise, Link costs roughly $10 a month, but with that you have access to 43 languages. Also, we have made the learning of Ukrainian free at Link. So anyone who wants to learn Ukrainian can just get on and start learning Ukrainian. So maybe I'll stop there and just see if there are any questions.
Okay, so thank you very much. So Steve, do we have any questions, from the audience? So if you like, you can unmute yourself and speak, or you can write your question in the chat. I'll read out one question here. Incredible story. Thank you for sharing your experience with us. So happy to hear you enjoyed Ukrainian food in different parts of our country. Thank you for your support.
Well, happy to do it. I should say that I continue to support the small NGO based in both Dnipro, and two ladies who used to be in Krasnohorivka and have now gone to Kiev. And I will continue to support Ukraine financially, very modest, contributions. But I think the whole world is looking at Ukraine, and I just awe-inspiring, the courage and the determination of the Ukrainians. And I just hope that the year 2023 brings an end to this tragedy. An end based on the full recovery of all territory that were part of Ukraine before 2014.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Well, Steve, I have some questions.
Yeah.
You talked about how you by learning Ukrainian, you are able to access Ukrainian history and culture from the point of view of a Ukrainian and not just a Russian point of view. Could you give us some more examples of how knowing Ukrainian enriched your experiences in Ukraine or with Ukrainians in a way which you would not have experienced if you had only spoken Russian?
Well, let's start with when I was learning it. Obviously, the history of Ukraine as told by Ukrainians is different from the history as told by Russians, as told by Poles, for example. When I was learning Polish, I read and listened to audiobooks on Polish history. So obviously, the perspective is very, very different. And I think it's very important to understand the history of a country as told by the people of that country. It gives you a different feeling when you meet with them as to who they are. The other thing is, obviously, in Kiev, most of the people you meet, at least back when I was there, speak Russian. Not in Lviv, they all spoke Ukrainian. Not all, but the vast majority. So in Dnipro, of course, if you go to a restaurant or wherever, it's everyone's speaking Russian. But speaking Ukrainian was interesting. I had, on a number of occasions, took a Uber driver and we would chat. And certainly the people I met there, kind of almost, they said, I speak Russian, we speak Russian at home, but I'm glad my kids are learning Ukrainian at school. It's as if, Ukrainian is the language and one has to be very careful because I don't think people want to trample on the language rights of anybody. And there is no sense in Ukraine that you are at least when I was there, that there's any guilt associated with speaking Russian. People speak what they're going to speak. but there was that sense that, Ukrainian is our thing. Ukrainian is a bit of a symbol of who we are. Yeah, maybe my grandparents spoke Ukrainian, and then everyone ended up speaking Russian. So I'm glad now, once again, that my kids are learning Ukrainian at school. This is in Dnipro, which is supposedly, Russian speakers. And if you believe some of the very poorly informed people who say, well, the Russian speakers in Ukraine, they want to be Russian. Not at all. In fact, even in Eastern Ukraine, I arrive in, I guess, Kramatorsk or wherever. I came off the train out of Dnipro, and I'm met by this guy who only speaks Russian in this Russian-speaking part, and he's got the Pravi sector flag flying on his Lada. Okay, so now that doesn't represent everybody in Kramatorsk, but there is, this is the thing I think people don't realize. Yes, the society in Eastern Ukraine, particularly in the Donbass, was divided, and it was a domestic, call it, dispute, conflict, tensions, such as we have in Canada, in the province of Quebec, such as exist in Catalonia, such as exist in many places in the world. And if the Russians had never invaded and interfered and sent initially their volunteers and the regular army and arms and money and all of those things into the Donbass, they would still have those conflicts, and they would be arguing on Schuster Live and all the rest of it. But it would remain a domestic issue. And obviously, in Ukraine, the language is important as a national symbol, and yet there has to be some measure of respect for, at least before the Russian invasion, respect for the language rights of people who prefer to speak Russian. There's nothing inherently evil in speaking Russian. It's like if you live in Quebec, there's nothing inherently evil in speaking English. But in Quebec, they wanted to reestablish the position of French, because after all, they are the majority in Quebec. And in Ukraine, similarly, for example, in the Baltic states, the Latvians, there's only 1 million some Latvians. They want to make sure their language survives. So that there are some measures that are introduced, and this was the case in Quebec, that may be perceived as unfair by the speakers of the language that is kind of being a little bit disfavored. However, this is natural. It's to counteract, years and years of where the language, Ukrainian or Latvian or French in Quebec, were I wouldn't say, suppressed. So to understand Ukrainian and to understand the issue there, to understand that a lot of very patriotic Ukrainians are predominantly Russian speakers, and yet they respect the Ukrainian language, to understand that whole dispute and with all of its dimensions, it gives you something. It's very valuable, I think, when you visit Ukraine, to have some understanding of that background.
Okay, so thank you. We have a comment in the chat. I am from the US and started using Link after using the Pimsleur app. I have been studying for about a year and think Link method is very helpful.
Oh, well, that's great. That's great.
Are there any more questions? Again, feel free to unmute yourself or to write in the chat. Well, in that case, Steve, I'd like to ask a question that follows on from the last question, again relating to Ukrainian and Russian. You mentioned that you've talked about how many patriotics of Ukrainians who identify with Ukraine are Russian speakers. Personally, I suspect that in the West we have this idea of one country, one nation, one language, and which, in the case of Ukraine, I have never been to Ukraine, but this is why I'm asking, which doesn't seem to be true in the case of Ukraine. So one thing I'm also a very keen learner of Russian, and my hope would be that people don't think that learning Russian is necessarily learning the language of the enemy of Ukraine, but that people can see Russian as being actually one of the languages spoken by the Ukrainians. As you know, in Russian there are two words, Ruski and Rossiyski, and what is Rossiyski is not necessarily, Ruski, and vice versa. So what do you think can be done to promote sort of Russian sort of language learning in the sort of current climate in a way that is, and to help people to understand that actually by learning, Russian, they're not necessarily learning the language of an evil regime, but also they're learning a language that can help them to build a bridge with many Ukrainians, but also many people in former parts of the Soviet Union.
Well, when I first started learning Ukrainian, and I first discovered Ukraine back in 2014, and with my experience in Canada of bilingualism, which is official policy in Canada, I thought, gee, Ukraine should have 2 official languages. I no longer think that. I think it's going to take a long time for Russia to be rehabilitated. I mean, the Russian language is identified primarily with Russia. It's not fair because, in fact, Ukraine has quite a tradition of Russian language culture. And, at some level, certainly 7 years ago, I thought, geez, Ukraine could be a major center, is a major center of Russian language and culture. It is. But the aggressiveness of Russian imperialism, the nastiness of what we see on Russian television and what we hear from Russian leaders makes it very difficult. And yet I am sure that in day-to-day life in Ukraine, one thing that was absolutely astounding to me is in Ukraine when I was there, people speak to each other in 2 languages. So in Canada, you either speak English or you speak French. So if I'm with a French Canadian, I may speak French or we may speak English. But we don't have one person speaking French and the other person responding in English. Whereas in Ukraine, they carry on these bilingual conversations all the time. I don't know if that still goes on. When I started following Ukraine, leaders, members of the cabinet spoke Russian. Whatever that security minister of Armenian origin, I can't remember his name, but any number of them spoke Russian. It was quite normal. And now you hear less and less Russian. So I think what has to happen, I think theoretically Kyiv could be a center of Russian culture, language learning, etc., as well as Ukrainian. But I think first we have to get through the present situation. And there has to be a major change in Russia. And all languages that are widely spoken in the world, they were spread by imperialism. Let's be honest, right? Why are English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Russian widely spoken? Why did Quechua spread throughout the Andes? It was because of the imperialist activities of the Inca Empire, the Russian Empire, whatever. So as a result, Russian is obviously much more widely spoken than Ukrainian. And you can go to Kazakhstan and they will speak Russian. And maybe they speak Russian, the Kazakhs themselves speak Russian, maybe some of them better than they speak Kazakh. But I think that's going to change. I think the Kazakhs are going to speak more Kazakh. And because ultimately, if the empire cannot change from being an aggressive imperialist power into more of a soft power, like the British Commonwealth, La Francophonie, somehow turn the fact that through various reasons in history you were an aggressive imperialist power, but now you want to create a new relationship with countries where your language, where your language is used, based on equality between big countries and little countries, and that there is no big brother and little brother. Now, until the Russians come to grips with that, I think the influence of Russian and the popularity of Russian will continue to decline, including in Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. We have a comment and a question. The comment, 99% of my friends always spoke Russian in Kiev. Kyiv. Now, since the end of February the 22nd, they began to speak Ukrainian. I can see massive increase of Ukrainian language only in Ukraine, which means there will be more interest from outside the country too. And there's also a question about Link. I'm finding Link helpful. I find Ukrainian pronunciation very difficult still, but I am working on that with the isolated sentences in Link. I am not trying to talk Ukrainian with real humans yet. How important do you think it is for me to start talking?
Well, I am not a great fan of speaking until you are very comfortable speaking. There is no advantage to forcing yourself to speak. To speak means to have a conversation. If you don't have a good level of comprehension, you can't have a one-sided conversation where you say the 4 or 5 sentences that you are confident that you can use, and then you don't understand the answer. So in any language that I learn, the bulk of my effort is listening and reading, building up my comprehension, building up my vocabulary, getting my brain used to the language. And then when I start to speak, I'm going to struggle. You're always going to struggle, but it'll be easier. I'll understand what the other person is saying. I'll have some words that I can use. That's point number one. With regard to pronunciation, obviously pronunciation is difficult. You need to hear so much of the language. And if you start speaking too early, I mean, some people say you can actually ingrain some bad pronunciation habits. I don't know if that's true or not. I just feel that there is no need to speak early. And if the more you can't pronounce what you can't hear, and when we start, we can't even hear the pronunciation. We can't hear certain aspects of the pronunciation. But when we have listened to so much of the language, we get better. And I would even recommend that at Link, you go in sentence mode and then listen to the sentence and focus initially on intonation. And if you can start to imitate the rhythm of the language, a lot of the sort of vowel consonant sounds will start to come along. But it's not something you should worry about. The focus in speaking should be on communication and comprehension. So as long as you can understand and you can get your meaning across, you're doing fine, and you will gradually improve. And don't be too self-conscious about your pronunciation.
Yes, I mean, I'm glad that you mentioned you trying to copy the intonation. When I was learning at languages at school, I always found that was something that teachers never mentioned, to think about the intonation of what you're saying while you're saying it. So there would be a lot of focus on correct grammar, etc., or using the correct words, but not in speaking as if you were speaking, trying to imitate the way that first language speakers would speak. Are there any more questions? Okay. Well, we have sort of 5 more minutes before the break.
Okay.
Can I ask you one question,
Sure.
which is for people like myself who have learned Ukrainian but have never sort of been to Ukraine? What is there any specific advice that you would give to people who have been learning Ukrainian outside Ukraine before they go to sort of Ukraine? I know it's a very general question, but maybe there are things that you experienced in Ukraine in connection with the language that people who don't go there are not aware of.
Well, my advice, first of all, which is the case, I think, with any language that I learn, get as good as you can before going there. Don't think that you're going to go to Ukraine, well, I'll just go there and I'll learn. It's not that easy, because you can't just talk to random people on the street if in fact you don't make sense in their language. They'll either switch to English or they'll just throw up their hands. So you have to, and I've done this with Czech, I've done this with Romanian, I've done this with other languages. I work as hard as I can to improve my comprehension. I'll maybe start some online discussions with language exchange or tutors. So when I get there, I have a chance of hitting the ground running. That's very important. Number two, any country you go to, don't be discouraged. You often hear people say, oh, I went to Germany, I was in a store and I said something in perfect German and they answered in English. Not everyone is going to humor you just because you are learning their language. And you can get 10 different reactions from people. And you will find those people who give you a positive reaction, which in Ukraine is most of the people. I still remember I was in Lviv. I walked into a bar, or it was at a restaurant, but there was a bar at the entrance, and there were some young people there, and I said, Dobro večer, or whatever, said a few words in Ukrainian. Wow, 3 beers come out for me. I got, friends, and this is the kind of thing. So that's not always the case. You might find someone who's in a sour mood and doesn't want to humor you. You can't be too hung up on these things, but overwhelmingly, if you speak and you say anything in Ukrainian to a Ukrainian in Ukraine, I would say overwhelming, you get a very, very positive reaction. But you have to be practical. You have to be able to actually hold up your end of the conversation. So if you engage someone in a conversation, you can't just say, oh, sorry, I don't understand. You have to have a fairly good level of comprehension, which can be achieved before going there, using link amongst other methods. And so really, once you go there, and obviously the first few days is great trepidation and you're afraid and stuff like that. But that's always true. If we want to be totally comfortable, we speak our own language. So once you are wandering into this other space where you're speaking this foreign language, you're going to make mistakes, you're going to stumble, you're going to feel uncomfortable. That goes with the territory. That's what it's all about. And you just have to keep going. And I find that after 2 or 3 days, you just gradually improve. And after a while, you don't worry about how well you performed. You worry about how well you were able to communicate.
Okay. Thanks. One more question here. I know you will have mentioned this during your talk, but the questions are, how did you learn Ukrainian? What were most difficulties for you? Could you sort of maybe sum up what was most difficult for you?
Well, you know, the difficulties of Ukrainian are the same as the difficulties of all Slavic languages, as I said. Verbs of motion, aspect of verbs, and case endings. And unfortunately, the case endings are not constant between Polish, Czech, Russian, Ukrainian. So it's difficult. And you can look at those tables over and over again, and they don't stick. Eventually, some of them stick. For me, the instrumental case stuck first, you know, z wami. Some of them will stick. The dative doesn't seem to stick. No matter how often you read the explanation, it makes no difference. No matter how many times you look at the table, it makes no difference. You just have to expose yourself to so much that after a while, you naturally start to say it correctly more often than you say it incorrectly. But those are the greatest difficulties. Yeah, and as to how I learned, someone asked, well, I learned through listening, using link. You know, as I said, Radio Svoboda, Hromadske Radio. Then Zalesniak, I think his name was, a Ukrainian historian. I listened to audiobooks and read the transcripts of the history of Ukraine. I just consumed a lot of material in Ukrainian. And I had a Ukrainian online teacher twice a week. You know, after a while, when I felt that I was able to say something, then I would speak to her, and she was based in Dnipro. Oh, and the other thing I did, by the way, I found that I was going to Lviv. So I found it. There's the Ukrainian Language and Culture Center in Lviv, and I contacted a wonderful teacher, Solomia, and what we did was I arrived in Lviv, and she arranged, like, for a whole week, we would meet at the this coffee shop in Plosha Rynok, and then we would go out and we visit the museum. We visited this large cemetery in Lviv, this, you know, monastery, whatever it was. We visited different places, and we would speak. And she would make note on her iPhone of all of my errors or all of the phrases that I had difficulty with, which is kind of what we do at Link when we have an online session with a tutor. And so then I would go back to my room at noon, and I would have a list of 20 words and phrases that I struggled with, which I would then import into Link, and I study them, and then I meet her again at 2 o'clock, and we'd go off and see some other part of the city. And we did this for 5 days. So that was, again, and I was speaking with her in Ukrainian all the time. But I had to be at a certain level in order to do that. And so this was kind of the culmination of all of my efforts of learning on my own. Then, because even if I go to Lviv, I can't just sit down, you know, someone sitting there, sit down and have a conversation with someone that I don't know. So, I mean, you can have short conversations, but I found that it was very useful to line up a teacher who would spend, you know, 6 hours a day with me and who would note down all the problems that I had, then email them to me, and then I could study them. So that was another thing I did for learning Ukrainian.
Okay. Okay, so we've come to the end of this session. Thank you very much, Steve, for a very interesting talk and for the discussion afterwards. Now I will stop the recording, but I will leave the chat open. I will leave the meeting open so you can people can still talk with each other during the break. We'll start again in 13 minutes at 6:15 British time, and then we will have Natalia Zavizir talking about cultural differences between the United Kingdom and well, between English language and Ukrainian language. So thank you very much. I'll stop the recording now.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.